It's not good. Okay, obviously I have more to say than that. Today we're going to be taking a look at The Legend of Zelda for the NES, the first game in the beloved series, the one that led to us getting Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land 20 years later. The Zelda series is easily one of the biggest franchises in all of gaming, second only to Mario and maybe Sonic in terms of recognition. A vast majority of people consider it to be one of, if not the greatest series in all of gaming, and I'm definitely one of those people. Zelda's one of those rare franchises where almost every game is not only great, but are almost instantly considered to be one of the greatest games ever made. Link to the Past, Breath of the Wild, Wind Waker, and Majora's Mask, Ocarina of Time is still the highest rated game ever on Metacritic, Twilight Princess, the best one. My point is that this is easily one of the most renowned series in the entire industry, to the point where me telling you all this is pointless because you know just how legendary this series is. Even if you're the biggest Nintendo hater of all time, you're still at the very least aware of what a big deal this franchise is. Decade after decade, these games manage to top sales charts and be the absolute cream of the crop when it comes to critical reception. But much like humanity, everything's gotta start somewhere. Zelda 1 was developed at the same time as the original Super Mario Bros. And was thought of as the exact opposite of it. Super Mario Bros. Was a smash hit and pretty much reinvented the 2D platformer and spawned the biggest franchise in all of gaming. The original design philosophy behind Super Mario Bros. Was to create a linear action game, one that emphasized skill mastery and level memorization. But Shigeru Miyamoto wanted to develop a game that would instead emphasize exploration and evoke a sense of discovery. That game would eventually become The Legend of Zelda. Much like how Super Mario Bros. Reinvented the platformer genre, Zelda pretty much laid the groundwork for how you make an adventure game. Most adventure games before this were of the point-and-click variety, typically being solely about adventure and story. But Zelda was different, as while it was still about the adventure, it had action elements and felt like an action RPG. While it's not an RPG as it lacked some of the elements that define the genre, it clearly took a lot of inspiration from them, instead being one of the first examples of an action-adventure game. Miyamoto described the motivation behind wanting to make Zelda by saying he wanted to make a game that gave players the same feeling he got by exploring the woods as a kid. Because of that, the game wouldn't feature much in the way of tutorials or hints, as they just expect you to figure things out on your own. The Legend of Zelda came out to universal acclaim, with people praising the openness and the freedom the player has right out of the gate. Over the years though, people have been a lot more critical of this game. It's still considered to be one of the all-time greats, but its flaws become a lot more apparent with age. Much of the game is considered cryptic or straight up misleading a lot of the time, and what once was a universally praised epic now just feels like a stepping stone for better games to come. Now, do I agree with the notion that this game hasn't aged well in the slightest? Yes. I love the Zelda series, but for a vast majority of my life, I actively avoided the first game like the plague. Every time I look back to older games in the series, I could always tell from a glance if I find them fun or not. But when I looked at the first game, all I could think of was, no. There's this feeling you get when you tie so much of your identity to being a gamer that you have to play every game that people consider the best. I like to think I'm much more mature now, and I know there's nothing wrong with simply not being interested in a game, even if everyone else is. But when I was in middle and high school,
I bought Call of Duty World War II. I'm not a bitch, I swear.
Yeah, I absolutely was a slave to peer pressure, especially once I hit high school and a lot of my friends were really into retro games. I'd played quite a lot of the classic Nintendo, Sega, and Sony games, but there were a few I hadn't touched or even known about. One day I'm talking to my friends about math or some junk, and then an intrusive thought hits my head. Oh shit, I've still never played the original Zelda. I booted up my NES Mini, loaded the game up, and tackled the entire thing in one sitting. The verdict?
Listen, I love Zelda 1. Except for the part where I have to play it.
I didn't hate this game, but I for sure didn't love it. You gotta realize by this point that I had already played almost every game in the series and had a lot of fond memories with all of them. Ocarina of Time I had during my childhood, I think we had just gotten Wind Waker HD on Wii U and it was amazing. And Twilight Princess is my favorite Zelda game of all time, so you know I'm a freak. Hell, even if you look at some of the older ones, I love Link to the Past and I think it's the Zelda game I've beaten the most. And I think I was actively playing Link's Awakening at the time. So to go from all those games to this, well, I've always been the type of person who prefers older games, and I think a part of that is the fact that the N64 and Super Nintendo were my first systems, so I don't have a problem going back to older games, but I'm not blinded by nostalgia or driven by this feeling that older things are just inherently better. Some old games just haven't aged that well. The first Metroid, Ice Climber, anything by Atari, and I had this exact feeling about Zelda 1 when I played it for the first time. However, I do remember having some fun with it, and I haven't played it since like 2018. So I wanted to revisit the game today and see if maybe my thoughts have changed over the years. The game opens up with one of the most iconic pieces of music of all time, let alone in a video game. This was different from almost everything that came before, as it wasn't trying to simply be an ear-catching melody like the music from Mario. It was trying to do something that had rarely been seen in a game before: set a tone. Anyways, you get this text sprawl if you hang on the title screen for long enough, and I'm already confused. Many years ago, Prince Darkness Ganon stole one of the Triforce with power.
His first name is Darkness?
Princess Zelda had one of the Triforce with wisdom.
What, as opposed to stupidity?
She divided it into 8 units to hide it from Ganon before she was captured. Why the air quotes around Ganon? Is this them trying to confuse me? Cause I mean, it's working. Go find the 8 units, Link to save her. Where? Okay, obviously this was the result of a translation error, but the broken English on display here is why many find this game to be cryptic and confusing. Luckily, if you have the game's manual, you got a slightly better explanation of the game's story, but how many people are going to have the manual, especially today? I don't think this is detrimental to the game at all. I just think it's funny. So the point of the game is to collect 8 pieces of the Triforce and put an end to Ganon's reign of terror. The intro also shows you a list of the items in the game, ranging from a sword, a white sword, a magical shield. Who does Nintendo think they're fooling? That's not a shield, it's a Bible! Christianity doesn't exist in Hyrule, this ruins the entire timeline! Okay, so we press start and our ears bleed with the sound effect for choosing our name. I always name the character Link just because I feel like it's morally right to do so. I think this time I'll just name him Earl. So we start the game and it's just you and Earl staring at each other. There's a hole in that cave over there, but I didn't make it this far by playing by the rules. Let's go explore this way and Jesus, I can't, fuck! Okay, let's check out the cave then. Here we're greeted by an old man who says one of the most well-known lines in all of gaming before leaving behind a wooden sword. Now we can actually attack those enemies that jumped Earl a second ago. While we're on the subject of attacking enemies, let's talk about the combat real quick, cause there's not much to say. The A button swings the sword. Well, less swing and more so poke. If you're at full health, a beam comes out of the sword, giving you a projectile attack. Which is great, because right now Earl wants to stay as far away from these enemies as possible. You have almost no protection from any of the enemies in this game right at the start. You do have a wooden shield, but A, it only works on projectile attacks, B, it only works on attacks to your front, and C, it doesn't do diddly goddamn jack shit against physical attacks. Which really sucks because while the first enemies in the game you see, these Octoroks like to spam these rock projectiles, nearly everything else in the game just likes to throw themselves at you like you stole their money and they want it back. But right now, we got a stick, a wooden shield, and that's all there is to it. Now, you may have noticed that the old man in the cave didn't really give us any direction, so where do we go?
I have no idea.
Nintendo made Zelda 1 as an open-ended adventure, meaning they wanted you to explore the world and find secrets at your own discretion. And getting some positives out of the way, I will give them credit. Walking around and exploring this overworld is actually kind of fun. You look at other adventure games like King's Quest, and the adventure element really comes in with you getting immersed into the world. But rarely did those games make you feel like you had free reign to explore in any direction you wanted. They're a bit too go here, do this to really feel like you have any freedom in their worlds, at least in my opinion. But the fact that Zelda gives you direct control, not being point and click, and the fact that they don't ever really restrict you at any point is actually really cool. Or a bit. So here's where my problem with Zelda 1 comes into play. Yes, they don't really restrict you when they let you roam freely, but it feels less like you're on an adventure with free reign of an open world, and more like you got thrown into the wilderness with a bag on your head, and the bag's on fire, and it's night. I had no idea what I was doing when I first played this back in 2018, and I had to resort to looking up a guide after an hour of wandering around. I'm not one of those purists that think that using a guide to beat a game means you didn't really beat it or whatever, but I do prefer to not use a guide if I don't have to, and I was able to beat every Zelda game I played before this without a guide. But here? Okay, let me just walk you through the opening sections of this game real quick. Get the sword from the old man, travel to the right and then up, killing every single enemy on the way and collecting as many rupees as possible so you can go into this specific cave and buy some bombs. Now you have to walk around bombing every single surface because the game all looks the same until you find these specific caves that reward you with heart containers to increase your health or rupees to increase your wealth. Keep collecting containers and rupees by blowing up everything and waking up living statues by throwing yourselves at them to find secret holes in the ground. Get stuck in an infinite loop, get lost, get lost, get lost. See, the problem with this game is that it's just too open-ended for its own good. In an effort to not hold the player's hand, they wind up not telling you a damn thing about how to progress. They just expect you to wander around aimlessly and figure this shit out on your own. But how are you supposed to know which walls to bomb or bushes to burn? And even if you stumble across a secret by accident, how are you supposed to know which ones are mandatory and which ones aren't? A lot of the secrets and items you find in the game aren't mandatory and are just meant to give you an easier time. Like with the blue and red rings, which decrease the damage you take, and the magic shield, which blocks magical attacks. But a lot of these so-called secrets, you need to be able to beat this game, and it's completely possible to skip them because the game doesn't tell you a damn thing. You need both sword upgrades, the white one to defeat some of the tougher enemies and the red one to defeat Ganon. But how do you find them without a guide? You don't! So unless you use a guide, be prepared to bomb the entire surface area of the map and hump every single block in the dungeons because you will have no idea what will and what won't lead you to a secret. Oh, and did I mention that on the way you die just a little bit? Because that happens a lot. The overworld sections are honestly my least favorite part of the game. They aren't bad, especially once you admit that you're a bitch and start using a guide. I actually think it's a lot more fun with a guide, almost like you're using a treasure map like in a typical adventure game. But it doesn't change the fact that this is still a glorified treasure hunt. Luckily, you can get most of the items you need in one go before you even reach the first dungeon. Speaking of which, let's talk about the dungeons. Despite the more muted color palette and the music being a bit too repetitive for my liking, this is honestly where most of the fun in Zelda 1 lies in my opinion. They're a lot more self-contained than the rest of the game, so that feeling that you're fumbling around where you shouldn't doesn't happen nearly as much. There's 8 main dungeons in the game, then a final boss dungeon in Death Mountain. In the dungeons, your goal is to clear rooms of enemies, solve puzzles, which just equates to you bombing walls and pushing blocks, and finding the dungeon map which leads you to a boss. Beat the boss, get the Triforce piece, then you kinda just do that again till the game's over. You can actually do the dungeons out of order if you want. You're only blocked from doing one if the path to it requires an item that you don't have. However, I would not recommend doing them out of order unless you want that to happen. The first dungeon is incredibly easy and basically acts as a tutorial dungeon. There aren't many secrets or difficult enemies, just get the map, get the compass if you want, get the bow here, fight this dragon thing, and boom, you're done. The second dungeon ramps up the difficulty a bit. There isn't much to this one either. You get the magic boomerang, fight some snakes, and that's really it. There's a dinosaur boss named Dodongo, and he's got a bit of a reputation in the Zelda community. See, you need to lay down some bombs for him to swallow, and given that you only have but so many of them before you run out, it's kinda easy to completely fuck yourself in this fight and need to go back and get bombs. Apparently. This is only my second time doing this fight ever, and neither time did I run out of bombs. It's not that hard, you just walk directly into him, place one, do that twice, and he dies. I don't know if the fact that I think this fight was easy makes me cool, but I do know that I'm putting it on my resume. Third dungeon, this one's noticeable because the layout is in the shape of a dear god censor that. Dungeon 4, we got a raft in the last one, so we float to a nearby island to get an extra heart container before we go to the next one. I thought this would be the entrance to the dungeon, but no, it's just one of this old guy's several hideouts. Man, the property tax in Hyrule gotta be low as fuck for this guy to afford this. Anyway, Dungeon 4, home of these parasites. If you get too close to them, they'll suck Earl up and eat his shield, downgrading it back to the regular wooden one, meaning you have to go back and buy another magical shield. Guess what happened to me? The boss is this Hydra thing, cut its head off and they'll start flying around shooting projectiles at you. It's really easy, on to the next dungeon. Dungeon 5, before we come here we have to get the final sword upgrade. We gotta go to the graveyard and fuck around with ghosts for a minute before pushing this gravestone inside and bam, magical sword. You can also get the power bracelet here which lets you push these boulders out of the way. Well actually only like 2 of them. Yeah, the optional items in this game range from useful, like with the boomerang which lets you stun enemies, to completely worthless like with the power bracelet. Anyway, we get to the 5th dungeon and here we have the option to pick up the warp whistle. As someone who played Mario 3 before this game, it was kinda surreal realizing that this is actually where it comes from. You can use the whistle to teleport randomly around the overworld, but if we find a secret room in this dungeon, the old man gives us some advice on how to use it to beat the boss. Dig Dogger hates certain kinds of sound. Dungeon 6, here we meet my least favorite enemies in the whole game. These little wizard fuckers can go to hell and then die. They disappear and shoot these beams at you and you have such a short window when you can even hurt them and The boss is this spider thing, you shoot it in the eye, it's really easy. By now I think you've got the pattern down for the rest of the game. You go to a dungeon, do a few rooms of difficult enemies, maybe find some secrets, then you fight a stupid easy boss. On to Dungeon 7, we use the warp whistle to get rid of the water in this pool till it reveals the entrance. Wander around for a little bit until... What the fuck does that mean? Okay, so here's where I run into my first big roadblock. You might have noticed in some of the shops that there's what looks like a chunk of meat. It's labeled in the opening as bait, which made me think that it was for fishing or something because there's gigantic bodies of water everywhere, and you'd think with an item labeled bait you need to do something with fish. But not only is it not for fish, it's not been needed for anything else up until this point. There wasn't a single moment where I feel like I needed to spend 60 of my hard-earned rupees to get it, so imagine my surprise, my shock, my awe when I get to this dungeon and this guy won't let me pass until I give him the bait. Why? Why is this so cryptic? Why isn't it just labeled meat? Did they not realize that the word bait would imply that this has something to do with fishing? And even then, why does the guy just say fucking grumble grumble? What is anybody supposed to be able to discern from that? I had to leave the dungeon and farm for rupees to get the bait, then head back in, re-kill every enemy, then give the guy his goddamn lunch just so I could pass. It wasn't really as frustrating as I'm making it sound, but it was just baffling. Anyway, get to the boss, it's the same dragon from the first dungeon, swoosh swoosh stab onto the last main dungeon. This is what I mean when I say the game can be cryptic as hell. You have to burn this specific bush on this specific part of the overworld to access the 8th dungeon. That would be all well and good if this game had an actual functioning map. It's just a gray box. I don't understand how Nintendo expected anyone to memorize a thing in this overworld when the so-called map doesn't give you any information. Anyway, this dungeon wasn't too bad. I mean, it's filled to the brim with these enemies called Dark Nuts, these walking suits of armor that you can only attack from the side or back, but I pretty much have just been using the wand as my main attack since it gives you a projectile without needing to be at full health. It doesn't work on every enemy, and it isn't as strong as the fully upgraded sword, but hey, it got the job done. The boss is the Hydra thing again, and the reuse of bosses doesn't really annoy me like I thought it would. I know a lot of people hate this aspect of the game, but all the bosses are incredibly easy, so I don't even really care that they use some repeats. On to the last main dungeon, and for the final dungeon, this was really fun but incredibly easy. I picked up a magic key from the last dungeon, which opens every single door in the game, so I definitely think that made it way easier than it was supposed to be. This dungeon is huge, and while I didn't think it was a challenge, it did take me some time to get through the entire thing. You get one last magical ring, which gets you the red tunic, completely optional. Then you get the silver arrows, which you can totally miss, and are not optional. You get to Ganon, and this fight is bullshit. He turns invisible, and you can only tell where he is by where the projectile he spawns comes from, so you have a very tiny window to be able to hit him. Luckily, if you stand in one of the corners and spam your sword, you're bound to hit him a couple of times. Afterwards, he turns red, and you fire just a single silver arrow, and Jesus! He just explodes into a pile of gore on the ground. This is supposed to be a kid's game, Nintendo, dial it back a little. You pick up the Triforce piece from Ganon's bloody remains, then we rescue Zelda. Thanks, Link, you're the hero of Hyrule.
I thought his name was Earl.
Well, all's well that ends well. Oh my, seizure warning! Thanks, Link. Finally, peace returns to Hyrule. This ends the story. That's Zelda 1 in its entirety, and don't mistake my rambling as me saying that I hate this game. Yeah, I think the overworld sections are a confusing mess without a walkthrough, and yeah, I think the game can be cryptic beyond belief a lot of the time. And yeah, the combat and puzzles are extremely undercooked compared to later games, but you know what? I didn't really notice any of that this aggressively as I did the first time I played it. The game actually got more fun the deeper I got into it. I can chalk that up to the fact that the latter half of the game is mostly dungeons, but still, I can totally see why this game spawned the legendary series that it did and why so many people have so much nostalgia for this game. Now, would I recommend beating Zelda 1 nowadays? Look, in the modern day when we have access to nearly the entire Zelda catalog on Nintendo Switch, I just cannot in good faith tell someone to play this game when they can play literally any game that succeeded it. Except this one, you could probably skip this one. The game is good, but it's absolutely a product of its time, and I think it's better suited as a relic of the past rather than an everlasting work of art. The game is absolutely a masterpiece, but one best appreciated from a distance.
Is Zelda 1 a bad game? No. Is it the masterpiece it was 40 years ago? Also no. What it is the Dark Souls of NES game.